Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. I'm here with Tiffany St. James. How are you doing, Tiffany?
I'm very well, thank you, Matt.
It looks like you're in a basement somewhere. And now we're actually doing video ones. I feel like you're in a bunker. Are you in a bunker?
I'm not in a bunker. I do a lot of recording, and therefore I keep it very blank behind, which it changed so much dramatically when everyone started working, more from personal spaces. But I do that so that I can record things and share them with people with no interference in the backdrop. So it does feel a little bit bunker-esque, but it is a solid wall. I'm not going to disappear into it.
Well, Tiffany, today we're going to go everywhere from AI to Bhutan. So let's kick off by you introducing yourself to our listeners.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Matt. Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me on this podcast. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Tiffany St. James. I am the Chief Commercial Officer of Vitalis Capital. And essentially, we look at raising funds for really interesting impact projects. I've worn a few hats over the years. I've always consulted for myself, and I run a consultancy helping embed better digital and AI skills within public sector and leadership.
How do you decide what's impactful, Tiffany?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? So there's all kinds of measures for this. So it's not Tiffany says, you'll be glad to know. There's some brilliant tools out there from the World Bank, from the OECD, and UNICEF. I've got a good framework. And some of the work that we do is take the frameworks and take the doctrine and take the international indexes that exist and then look at what is most particular and pertinent for the types of clients we work with, which is small island, developing states and emerging economies.
Love that. So I'm going to start with a massive bias because my favorite international index is the happiness.
Of course, right?
So I have to ask you, what makes you happy?
Oh, well, that's really kind of you. So I love having intelligent conversations with brilliant people. It lights me up like a Christmas tree. I love relaxing and chatting and having wine in the sunshine with some good friends. But for me, being productive at the end of the day makes me really happy too. So a blend of all those three things, I would say.
Well, you're in for being let down if you're hoping to have a conversation with an intelligent person today. But well, I will try my best. I'll try my best. So, tell us about your career. Like, I met you. We were both talking at an event for charities, and I couldn't believe like some of the projects you worked on. Like, one minute you're working with the government, next week it's a huge brand. Like, how did you get started? Like, take us back, Tiffany.
Right place, wrong time, maybe. I did one of the first degrees in international marketing in the country. And at the time, marketing was a new thing, now everyone's looking far more into kind of psychology and happiness, of course. But essentially, I had to work for a year post uni because my mother said it would look good and stable on my CV. And I realized that actually, if we're looking at any marketing to the UK and using languages, which were the two combined, the marketing wasn't as sophisticated because the products are going to developing countries. And therefore, I threw it in, walked in, went freelance for a 6-week contract in the UK government and carved out a career over 14 years working for an amazing amount of brilliant people within government and many different departments within that. So I joined central government when we had no email, and I left when we had open data. So the really early period where everything went online and everything got kind of torn down and repositioned and restructured through that period. So I started Direct Gov, which was the precursor to gov.uk. So putting all government services for the first time in one brand, one tone of voice, because research shared that people didn't care what department it came from; they just needed the information, right? So really research led, and over the course of sort of 3 to 4 years, we built up Direct Gov in terms of that. And at the time, it was the world's largest web rationalization program. And we had the opinions of other governments in the world asking us how we were doing it, what we were doing, and what was our process so that they could learn from us. And then social media popped up post, Web 1 and moving into Web 2.
Yeah.
Became the first head of social media as the pan UK government lead within Cabinet Office across 22 government departments. My title was head of public participation, which made me head of social media. and then co-creation of public policy making, because we were actually working on open consultations and working with the public. And then I had the great pleasure to launch data.gov.uk with Sir Tim Berners-Lee as part of our small crack team of
Yeah.
7 in Cabinet Office to launch that. And I guess if you look at emerging technology, I've looked over the fence and seen technology develop and then apply that to clients as fast as I can, understanding it and running that across 22 government departments is the same as going to a global HQ and doing the same for 22 countries. So I then, exited government and have only been working both in public and private sector since, but for my own consultancy, running digital transformation.
Wow.
So sorry, that's a very long in terms of that, but I thought
There are three very large questions that I just need follow-up questions that I have to ask based on some of that stuff. So that huge project where you take all these departmental websites and put them into one, and I'm not asking from a website perspective. I'm guessing one of the biggest challenges was the people.
Oh yes.
Because you look back now, you think, oh, as a consumer or as a citizen, that's great. It's all in one place. But I imagine there was millions of different reasons why that shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
What did you learn if you had to encapsulate it down? Because everyone listening will be working on their own version of change management projects.
Yes.
The world is changing faster potentially than it ever has. But you were the center of government trying to change stuff with people that not necessarily known for loving change, is my polite way of putting that. What did you learn from that, Tiffany, that you can share that could be other people could take from that?
That's really kind of you. So it's horizontal transformation when you go across, many different government departments. They're ring-fenced budget. They've got their own teams. They don't necessarily have to interact with each other on a horizontal way. So the first thing that we started was a pilot. So we just took 3 areas to be able to do. So piloting it, first of all, to prove, I guess, the proof of concept. So we took motoring, disabled people and carers, which was the part that I led on, and another policy area. So try tests, that great doctrine. The second thing is that when that proved to be working, we had it mandated from on high. So we had the Prime Minister say, this is it. But still you have someone say, yeah, but not on my watch. Not, we're an exception in terms of that. So we had to do extreme stakeholder management. I mean, my role was to go to other departments and say, by the way, we're going to take your content and put 90% of it in the bin. You have to downsize your people, and you have to pay me for the pleasure of doing that. And you can imagine how that went down before it was mandated. But even when it was mandated, it was quite tricky to do so. So then you have to look at incentivization and disincentivization. So incentivization is looking at all the benefits that it will bring and working on a really strong benefits realization piece and communicating that really strongly. But then towards the end of the project, there was still some organizations that weren't sharing the cost, quality and usage of the websites because actually, they perhaps didn't have the strongest plan when they were first made underneath them. And at that point, they weren't giving us the data that we needed to be able to make the change happen. So as a team internally in government, we decided with our transparency agenda to call in auditors. So we called in ABC as an auditor and published the cost, quality and usage of every central government website because it created a public leader board almost that engendered the change from the people that still weren't, looking at change. So it was considered quite a brave move, I think, even a few years later. But we had to do a bit of both. And because of that, around that time, the UK government was declared one of the most transparent in the world.
Yeah, wow. I mean, everyone has been in those situations where you're trying to change something, but that's on a huge level. You mentioned Tim Berners-Lee. I just want to read out his profile, just that I've got up here on Wikipedia. So Timothy John Berners-Lee, also known as Tim BL, I didn't know that, as an English computer scientist, best known for the inventor of the World Wide Web. I mean, that's a pretty impressive CV. We have to ask, whilst you got here, what's it like working with Tim?
He was just as I'd imagined him to be, an affable academic and really easygoing. I mean, we had to We had to do a pre-launch with a lot of developers to build data.gov.uk, and the Guardian kindly hosted it at the time. And we had to sneak him up the service lift so the reporters wouldn't see him. And he was really up for just being really available, lending his brilliant giant brain behind the project, and obviously his good name at the time. So just an absolute pleasure to work with him. What a gentleman.
And that brings me to my final one, which is, these are all bonus questions that we never agreed on beforehand, but they have to be asked. Getting people who want to have impact, like Tim and like yourself, in the middle of government, how do you make impact without getting like squidged in by all the politics? Because that must happen as well, mustn't it? Like, every company has politics, but in government there must be even more actual politics. How? Because people want to help, they want to make an impact, like you. Have you got any tips on how you navigate through that to like not get sucked into like the mud of it all?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that have happened in government. I felt a huge privilege to be able to give the freedom to make change happen within central government. It was an era where there was huge growth. The first frontier. I mean, now we've got a frontier as big AI, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a bit more detail, Matt. But essentially, the frontier that was first in social media, we were working it out in a very public arena while the press are reporting on what you're doing. So it is sensitive, and you have to deliver. At the time, there was no other head of social media in any government worldwide. So there was no one else that I could speak to. There was a brilliant woman in the BBC, had the head of digital engagement as well, and we'd kind of compare notes. So part of not being mired in the politics, one of the things in open data is there was an independent report that was published openly and said these are the things that government should do to enable open data. So this is a traditional thing. It happened. I've been part of kind of a couple of policy reforms. So I was part of the national pensions debate years before digital, and there was an independent report produced by Adair Turner that said these are the 4 ways in which pensions must change. But then you have to roadshow it with the public and the ministers to understand which are the most palatable for the public in proper open consultation. So a really good way of doing it is to be able to get that open reporting, independent reporting, to say these are the changes that must happen, and then be able to take that and say, right, okay, so they've already said the what, we're just working out the how.
Yeah, got you. So there's a big theme throughout the answer to all 3 of those questions around transparency and working out so people can see it, so they don't feel like stuff's happening behind closed doors, so you can just be transparent. I love that. Tiffany, you mentioned there AI, like, as you said, like, there's an era of pre-email. We're now thinking about AI. This isn't generally about government, but what's your latest take on how AI will impact work and jobs?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I sit on 2 boards for AI. So the Global Wellness Institute, I'm part of their AI advisory board that look at wellness and globally and how AI is helping, as well as UK countries are out of the Global AI Council, which looks at AI ethics and AI literacy. So I look at it from a not just a UK or a more global perspective, but as well as looking at it from a literacy and ethical perspective. That if that helps, because it might explain how I might answer that, which is there's opportunities and challenges, of course. In the opportunities, we're seeing, huge burst in creativity. There will be new job creation, and people are, concerned perhaps in the challenges about losing jobs within the arena. But there's certainly, I know from social media, there's never any social media jobs when I was younger. Now you look at the whole industry that's grown up.
Yeah.
Right? It will create jobs. In the challenges, obviously, you've got bad actors that can operate at scale, and that was always the case in misinformation and disinformation, and hyper targeting. So we have seen that AI will have an effect on destabilization of democracy, but we've seen that with automated programmatic social media before the bigger wave that we've seen now of generative AI. I mean, AI has been around for 50 years or so. It's only the last 2 or 3 years we've had such open access on a personal level to such great tools. In the job market, I think it's really interesting that you're going to start to have job displacement, which is different than job loss, which is jobs changing because humans working with AI. You might have a call center, and a lot of the text or a lot of the chatbots might do a lot of the AI, but the job will still exist, and therefore that human endeavor and interaction is going to be absolutely necessary in terms of oversight. But what it does mean, well, the heavy reliance we've seen so much on AI is looking at, for leaders in this field, is really understanding critical thinking and problem solving and leadership through AI. So really understanding the changes that are happening and being able to um, help manage the changes that are happening to themselves and their industry and their organizations through it.
Yeah, and the historical event I always think about, which if you think about a prime minister that would be one of the most Marmite names to mention, would be Margaret Thatcher. And if you think about like the mines and closing of mines and things like that, if you spoke to pretty much any parent and you said, look, would you want your child to go and work down a mine? The answer for most people is going to be no. But people still want to be able to have an opportunity to go out, have some purpose, create, put bread on the table. And you look at some of those historical events and you think it's hard to argue that we don't want children and we don't want adults going down mines in the way that it was historically over the last however many 100 years. But it was those areas that lost that industry, that going back to that displacement bit, that the communities felt like they'd lost generations of work and so on, and identity. And I suppose that's the thing I think a lot of at the moment, which is if AI does displace jobs on large scale, how do we support people in society through that? Because if we don't, that is going to impact everyone, isn't it? Whatever level of society you're on, if it's bigger than in that case, it was areas that were reliant on mining, as an example. But here, this could be more widespread. So it's equally as important for us to work out how we support that. Is it possible to support it, or do you just have to wait and see, Tiffany? What's your view?
Well, I'm never a person to sit back on my laurels, the rest of my laurels, and wait and see. I like to get stuck in, and I guess that's why I feel that AI literacy is so important because if you feel that you're in perhaps a more brittle career, that AI might have an impact on it. By understanding AI and understanding how it works, you've got the opportunity to shape your role, to shape your career, to shape your job, or to shape your career path. And that might be in the industry you're in, it might be as an entrepreneurial bent. We know that people are taking on more portfolio work. And the way that you've got the kind of democratization of so many tools at such a free and inexpensive level in people's pockets means that they've got the opportunity to do a huge variety of things that perhaps they hadn't had the opportunity to do before. But it comes down to ensuring that we have access to good broadband, good digital skills, and good digital literacy to enable people to be able to make the better choices for themselves as the world changes.
Yeah, I love that, Tiffany. And we're now going to go on to your business and a word that you use when I first heard you talk, and you've mentioned it already a couple of times, so impact. So can you tell us about your impact business, please, Tiffany?
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm absolutely delighted to. So we there's four of us have set up Vitalis Capital. We only set it up this year. It's fairly new. And essentially it is an organization that looks at socioeconomic development and sustainable wellness, sustainable tourism in a variety of different environments. But we're starting to attract more projects in small island developing states and emerging economies. So it came from the CEO, a brilliant woman called Lucy Burley, who's a stalwart in the sustainable industry, has been doing sustainability mapping and sustainability accreditation across spas, hospitality, and hotel venues for a good number of years in her work in Sustainable Wellness Group. And essentially, people saw her work and started throwing projects across at Lucy to said, "Oh, you work in sustainability. Can you help us here?" And therefore, we set up Vitalis to be able to deal with these projects. So we find and match, brilliant investors and to fund these projects, but then actually working at the delivery of these projects is the work that we do and deliver that we've just stepped into now. I mean, I could tell you so much more about it, but I'll just pause there for a second.
Well, I'd like to know your why personally, Tiffany, rather than the organization. Like,
Sure.
you're very qualified in many different things, like from social media through to data through AI. So you could just be full time being an AI consultant, couldn't you, and make lots of money? But why is this driving you?
I've had to do some thinking about this myself, and I know it wasn't one of your questions you were going to ask, but I'm delighted to be able to answer. I have been trying to work out for the last few years how I can make the most impact with the skills that I've got. Uh, I've run my own business for a number of years. I've never wanted to scale an agency to grow and sell. I'm interested in problem solving. So I've created a consultancy where almost every day is different because you're solving real world problems through it. But essentially, I was a small consultancy myself with a group of 200 or so brilliant consultants you pull together to deliver particular projects. But essentially, I've been thinking, you get to a little bit in your life and you go, okay, what am I going to really, really lean into to the next decade or so? What's really going to interest me? And then I started to look at what are the organizations where I can create impact. So I looked at the UN, I looked at, Tony Blair's Institute for Global Change, I looked at Chatham House, I looked at these bodies, if you like. And actually, because I have worked for myself for about 25 years or so, solving problems, although I've done some brilliant things, that you stack up against other people who've had a more traditional career path, and I'm considered the wild card. And therefore, having to create impact. Oh, but you haven't done that managing a team of 50 for so many years in this kind of institution. Looking at these institutions, looking at more traditional career path. We didn't set up Vitalis in terms of finding the right people and put it together. We found each other and we started working on these projects and then decided to put a company house around it. So essentially, I'm doing it because I want to create more impact personally. And I didn't find there was an appropriate vehicle for the talents and skills we had. So we made one.
I love that. I love that. For me, the reason I love that is because it is taking the entrepreneurial spirit and it's putting it into the impact world. And sometimes people see like entrepreneurial as just as like a deliverer of greed, as an example. So, but I think your question that you asked yourself, which is how can my skill set create the biggest impact?
Yes,
That's something we should all be asking, isn't it? That sounds like a good universal. Is that a Tiffany St James question, or did you find that?
it is. And I'm going to own that.
I like that. I like that. So, Tiffany, this brings us on to Bhutan. When you work in happiness, people bring it up all the time. For those that don't know, I'm just going to read out a couple of things. So, in the late 1970s, the king said gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. Bhutan measures happiness by periodically surveying about 10% of the population and compiling statistics that fall under 9 domains, starting with living standards. So take us on the journey of Bhutan. Like, some people think this is like, I tell some people about this and they think that we're talking about some mythical place that doesn't exist. So you tell us what you know about Bhutan from your perspective, Tiffany.
Yeah, sure. And I can tell you about Bhutan and the what we had a cultural immersion in Bhutan in January. So the head of the Tourist Guide Association of Bhutan contacted us and asked us to come out to help. The country, like many emerging economies, have socioeconomic issues. They also have a lot of issue with talent migration, where people perhaps not being able to be qualified in the country in certain industries, leaving to get qualifications elsewhere, and then carrying on, working in other countries, or particularly they are lower in GDP. It's not one of the things that they measure their citizens on, as you kindly pointed out. But essentially, people can earn perhaps other revenue elsewhere, and therefore they have an issue with talent migration. And their idea, because they are they're a Buddhist country and they're centered very much on gross national happiness, and they're got an ambition to retain talent and to build their economy and a real focus on it. And the current king is a huge entrepreneur, and they are building Gilefu Mindfulness City. They're building a new airport. They want to attract, a million more people into the country to live and work there. The whole city is being built on, the 9 foundational principles of gross national happiness. And then they've had locked borders for a very long time, and they control and regulate tourism really sustainably, which is just brilliant to hear and understand, because they want to do things well and mindfully and bring people in. So it's been one of these countries that now is starting to attract wellness tourism with a bigger focus on mindfulness, a much bigger focus worldwide on wellness. And Bhutan's starting to, open up more than it has been in the past. It's now become a really attractive um, country to visit for people who want perhaps a spiritual journey, want to have wellness in a place that is quite sacred. And therefore, they're looking at actually how do they develop this sustainably. The other brilliant thing about Bhutan is because the top half of it in the foothills of the Himalayas, and then it goes down onto the plains in terms of, you know, the country's topography. And essentially, they are the first. I'm not sure if they're still the only. I need to have a look at that, but they were certainly the first net negative country. So they produce more energy than they can consume, and therefore, with that in mind, they've got they give electricity free to citizens. They're attracting businesses that are want to use a heavy kind of electricity within their infrastructure, and they're starting to change. And
Yeah.
they have, over the last few years. So that was there's a little bit of kind of back of the country, and we were brought out to look at developing 5. I think they said 40 to start with, but we thought we'd start with 5 wellness institutes that actually look at training people within Bhutan, the aid to keeping talent and industry within hospitality and wellness. Within that, they've got a beautiful some 5-star hotels, and they've got 3-star kind of homestays in between.
Yeah.
And they've got the most incredible natural resources. They've got these beautiful natural hot springs. They've got beautiful mountains, and people were hiking them. And essentially, to be able to put in a series of wellness institutes in the eastern part, where they're building the new airport and the mindfulness city, to help people with the economy and jobs creation, but to help with the talent education, set some international standards in sustainability and wellness, is what we were brought out to start to have a look at.
Yeah. And I just want to, there's so many points I want to go back to, Tiffany, here.
Sorry.
I, I'll just, again, keep setting the context for the listeners. I'll just read out something on my screen, because I want to go back to some of the numbers you talked about, and how they can do it sustainably. Because, so the Kingdom of Bhutan is a small mountainous landlocked country in South Asia, located in the eastern Himalayas, bordered by India and China. So Bhutan is home to a population of 780,000 people. And you mentioned they want to potentially bring another 1 million people in, so double the population. How do you do that without causing loads of problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things that we look at and why we're measuring impact, because you can't just open up a country and double its population without looking at wastewater, infrastructure, energy, food supply, the aspects that keep a country running within that. And which is why you've got to do it gently, mindfully, with purpose, to be able to do that, not just open the gates. So, I mean, they have uh the opportunity to gate it, because it's a Bhutanese airline that comes in, and there is a certain amount of seats, so they can actually look at, even if they built a city tomorrow, that managing the influx of people who want to work and live there, and tourists particularly, you can manage the influx in a really sophisticated way, which is great. But that's part of the work that we're doing in unwrapping, is that you have to look at this balanced scorecard for socioeconomic development overall. You can't just open the gates and build a city. You have to look at what is the effect, and putting some things here. What are the detrimental effects of doing a positive action, and being able to measure that effectively?
And I think that's very topical for something that's in the news at the moment, which is over tourism. Places like Spain, I think there was talk of there's so much going on in Europe and the hotspots. And I think there was an event I was in Romania this week, that those like famous places like Porto or like Egypt, they take like 90% off travel. Like 90% of travelers go to like 10% of the locations. What happens if this is so successful that Bhutan becomes unhappy because too many people are going there? How do you avoid over tourism? Because there'll be so many people listening going, "Oh, that sounds like the place for me. I want to go." And then, so how do you? I suppose it fits into you double the population, but then you get loads of tourism coming. How do we stop? Not stop's the wrong word, but how do you do that in a sustainable way?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's one of the things that we're obviously exploring and looking at and helping to demonstrate. First of all, that most of the economy and wealth of the country is in the west of the country. So actually, the opportunity to build a new airport, Anglo from one city in the east of the country is balancing that a little bit more, if you like. Timbuktu, the capital, is in the west at the moment. So they've actually looked at the geographical area that they want to bring in and to understand where is it best placed in the country to be able to bring that 10 million pen in that will actually balance the industrialization and where people live and the supply of that in terms of that. And it has to be done gradually, and it has to be done thoughtfully, and it has to be measured in terms of all of the reasons that I said, so that you don't have that knock-on effect of other aspects of that. And we haven't got all the answers yet. This is why we've been over a cultural immersion. The next step is that the report that we made from our cultural immersion has gone through government and with a really warm reception. And we need to then go back out to do that feasibility study and to look at this impact and to measure it effectively and to give them the data on that.
Yeah. So so what you're saying is it's been thought about and it is being planned rather than let's just bring in the tourists and see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. And Galefu is something separate than the wellness institutes that we're looking at developing out there. And it is they've got a whole team around it. They've been considering and looking at how they might build that for quite a time there anyway.
Yeah. So the next question is around gross national happiness. I think also what I'm about to read out shows you should never fully trust AI, because I've asked it to bring up the G8 leaders. It's got Vladimir Putin, Angela Merkel, Stephen Harper, Tony Blair, George W. Bush, Nicolas Sarkozy, Romano Prodi, and Shinzo Abe. So slightly out of date from this article I've got here. But let's just say that the G8 leaders were watching what was going on in Bhutan, and then a bit like in government, how you got the different departments to be like really competitive, and they made the change. Imagine what would happen if the G8 saw the work that was going on in Bhutan, and then they suddenly switched to gross national happiness and thought they suddenly became really competitive about it and switched, and that became the thing that everyone was competing over. Who could have the happiest country? Do you think it's realistic for other countries to switch to gross national happiness?
Do I think it's realistic? So it's going to depend on the leadership. What we have noticed, I mean, it was an incredible proposition, right? But what I think is really interesting is that most of economies are based on measuring in GDP, but it's got really, really big holes in it. If you look at the work that Jacinda did in New Zealand, looking at different measures of how a country should be measuring itself, that gross national happiness isn't the only alternative to GDP. It's probably just one of the more famous ones. But we're starting to see this shift of looking at what holistically, from a country perspective, what are the other attributes that people can move towards? So wouldn't it be brilliant if everyone would look at some of the markers that underpin gross national happiness as some of the measures? Now, would the countries in the G8 switch that? Possibly not, but that's why we're working with small island developing states and emerging economies, because they're smaller and the government are all sat near each other, know each other, and can ostensibly get things moving a lot faster. And it's really interesting in smaller territories that you can actually start to create shift and create things to happen and create movement, and then look at how you might be able to roll that out further. I mean, if you look at in the UK, when we changed making kidney donation an automatic point of getting your driver's license, we tried it in Wales first and then rolled it out nationally, and it's the same thing. I don't think necessarily the big guys are going to switch, but what do? Test small, learn, iterate. Let's look at smaller places where we can bring in some of these other markers and measure them really effectively.
I love how you're taking your A/B testing skills from your digital world and turning it into how to run countries, Tiffany.
Yeah, I wanted more impact, Matt.
I love that, because actually what we're saying is probably, well, unrealistic to change to gross national happiness overnight. However, if the index that was measured started to change over time based on success in other countries, maybe the blend can change, and
Yes.
and maybe it's just too much over here one way, and maybe that shift is too much one way. But maybe if there was an index created that looked at more of the holistic things, then actually we might actually be getting a better measure on the success of a country. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
That's brilliant, fair summary. Thank you so much.
Okay. Anything else on Bhutan that you're thinking about at the moment in the future, Tiffany? Like, we've talked about the sustainability bit about it. We've talked about the bit that we haven't touched on, I suppose, is retaining talent in the country. And then this is geopolitically, this is another challenge that lots of countries face as well. Any
Yes.
any thoughts on where you're thinking around how do you retain the talent in the country?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is looking at what are the jobs that are needed within that country and what are they needed in near future, 2 years out, 5 years out within that, because countries change. I mean, when we started putting this mapping together, um, 60% of it will stay the same and 40% of it will change per country. And you've got landlocked countries, and then we've got groups of islands we're dealing with. I mean, ones will in the west and ones in the east. So there's all kinds of different elements that might change. But essentially, if you're looking at keeping people in a country, you have to look at holistically, why are people not coming? Why are people leaving? Right. And there's different reasons for that. And they change depending on the country. And it might be tax reasons, and it might be personal safety reasons, and it might be tax regulation, or it might be there's not opportunities to have a nice lifestyle. And you have to look at this. We look at different countries and look at this talent migration piece and saying, what is the cause? Now, we can do as a private entity some of that, but a lot of the work is governmental. So what is the government doing to put in, regulation, to be able to help sustain economies moving forward? And that piece of work is so critical. We could make it the loveliest place to work. We could create jobs. We could create industry, but actually is working hand in glove with government to be able to set up for the future to stop, to mitigate as much as they can talent migration.
Yeah. And I suppose that whole thing goes back to your whole more of a blended index, doesn't it? Because where are people going to want to work and live? Let's take some basics like clean water and money to feed your family. Like, both pieces have to be answered, don't they? Because Bhutan comes up as one of the happiest places, but people are still leaving. So it's kind of a case study in itself as well. You do need both. You do need the economic bit, and you do need the well-being piece. And I think there's so much in there. I'm just going to end on a question um, uh, on testing, because I think we're coming on to a good thing here about how you A/B test stuff on a not just a company wide but society wide. I have to credit my dad. He had an idea around, if you speak to most retailers, they say, look, you just need to reduce business rates. Then you speak to other people, they say, well, we need to tax income from business rates. My dad had idea was, why don't you just take a town that has been really struggling for a long period of time and test it for 10 years, and you actually put the funding in and say, we're going to have zero business rates for shops in this town, and see what happens. Because you'd find out very quickly, wouldn't you? Is the tax income more? Is it less? Does it negatively impact the other towns that are near it? Like, the only way to find out is test stuff. So this is a question I'm just going to chuck at you, Tiffany. What other tests would you love to run globally to find out how things can progress? And that can be either on businesses, on society, or on a country. This is a big question. I'll give Tiffany no time to prep. So what other tests in the world would you like to?
What would I like to test in the world? Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, you talk so much about happiness and the great work that you do in Index, and we've seen the world change in terms of the more focus about well-being. I'm in the middle of an MSc in leadership psychology. Subjective well-being is the part of your happiness that I delve into the most, and we've seen how that has changed. We also know all of there's Holos Change, a brilliant organization that look at cultural change, look at the megatrends. What are the megatrends? Well, some of those megatrends are climate, aren't they? And some of those are industrialization, and some of those are digitization. If you look at those, so actually, what are you testing here? You're testing the biggest levers that are going to have that help. And I think that for so long we've been looking at the economic levers without looking at some of the things that we've been talking about here in terms of the well-being levers. But I think that you can't leave that alone out of climate, because climate is changing so much. And therefore, if I could test three things, it would be, yes, the economics, and certainly the well-being, but hand in glove with climate, which is why we've got the focus on sustainability that we have, that we're so interested in. So three things, not one thing, if that's okay.
That's really good. In summary, we finished where we started, which is discussing indexes and the need for good quality data, which some of the listeners may be as geeky as us and loving good quality data to assess this stuff. But for those that weren't, I'm sure they enjoyed the stories as well, Tiffany, because it's amazing what you're doing. And I think the thing that people are going to remember is that question that you need to ask yourself, which is, of all your skills, how can you make the best impact out there? I think we're going to leave on that. And I will just say thank you, Tiffany. I have learned a lot and very, very much enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me on today. I've loved it. Thanks, Matt.